This is day 3, and what I'm doing now is I'm cleaning up and inspecting these internal parts from the top end. The piston is right here, and I want to be able to take this wrist pin out, and I want to know which way it went in, just in case there's any difference in wear from one end to the other. So what I did was I made a very slight pencil mark on the interior of that wrist pin in the shape of a plus, and then I scratched a plus sign on this part of the piston that doesn't come in contact with the cylinder wall at all, so that now I can take this out anytime I want, and it doesn't matter whether or not I inadvertently turn it over. I will know when I go to put it back in which way it goes in. That's if it even passes the test as far as wear limits. So there's some discoloration on it in spots, but it passes the fingernail test. It's perfectly smooth. There's no, you can't feel that at all. So I'm not too worried about the way it looks. I'm more going to be more concerned with what it actually mics out to. These parts shouldn't have a lot of wear on them. The mileage on this quad when it died was only 1,000 miles. So anyways, that's I started taking out the piston rings. This is the lowest ring. Then the next ring up is actually stuck in the groove. More of that rust. So I'm going to need to get that ring out. And then the oil control ring is in 3 sections. That's the bottom ring here, the widest groove, that actually has this thin little metal piece, and then this oil control ring section, and then another little thin metal piece that forms a little 3-piece sandwich that goes in this larger groove. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little bit of solvent and clean up this piston. This piston actually didn't even have a lot of carbon on it. Wasn't bad at all. A lot of it just wiped off pretty easily without even any solvent. So that's another indication that this engine didn't have a lot of time on it when it was dumped in the lake. So I'm going to clean this up now. Okay, I'm letting the piston soak a little bit, and while it's soaking I turn my attention to the cylinder head. I've cleaned a lot of the oil out of the top of the cylinder head, mainly just so that when I turn it over I'll be able to not have oil go all over the place. And if you look at the underside here, you can actually see we've got a mixture of carbon and rust on this sucker. So I'm going to just clean that up a little bit now. This is what the piston looks like after it's cleaned up. You can see it. It's really nice and clean. And what I use is this liquid here. It's called Purple Power. The reason why I like it is because it's cheap. You can buy a large container of it for about 20 bucks at the auto parts store. It's a water-based solvent. The bad about it is I only soaked this piston for about 10 minutes, and then I immediately cleaned it with a soft brush, scrubbed it, and then I rinsed it in hot water. And make sure you get all of the remnants of the solvent off of it. What I found is I've used this successfully to clean all kinds of parts, including carburetors. But the last carburetor that I did was the Arctic Cat, and instead of just soaking it for a little while and then doing what I just said to do, rinsing it thoroughly and making sure it's perfectly dry, I soaked it for overnight, and that was a mistake. It turns out that over time this will react with aluminum in a negative way. It'll cause this white material to this corrosion to appear, and it becomes problematic to clean off. So make a long story short, you can use it, but don't use it on aluminum parts for long periods of time. And then the other thing about this stuff is, you notice I'm wearing gloves. Do not get this stuff on your skin, especially straight like that. It's highly caustic, and what it does is it leaches all of the natural oils right out of your skin and will cause your skin to start to just peel. And I did that inadvertently when I first got this stuff. I got some on one of my hands, and I noticed that that hand had like almost like alligator skin for a few days after doing that. So that's the caution about using that stuff, but it does a great job on this kind of a part, so that's why I like to use it. So now that I've cleaned up the piston, I'm now going to see whether or not I can get that stuck ring out of the groove. And the ring gap is actually so tight on the end there that you can barely get anything in there, but you can just get a very sharp pick in there and try and pick at it. If that doesn't work, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in a vise, and I'm going to use a sharp blade of putty knife and give it a tap to see if I can't work it free out of that groove. Because once I get it to actually move a little bit and break free from the groove that it's stuck in, then I should be able to get a pick in there and pick the ring out. Last thing I want to do to this piston to finish cleaning it is to clean out the grooves. An easy trick to cleaning the grooves on the piston, any carbon that might be built up in there and whatnot, is to use a old piston ring. What you do is you just snap one of the piston rings. They're kind of brittle, so you can snap them, and then you can use the edge of the piston ring to actually scrape in there. And of course you would use the ring sized for the groove that it came out of to clean it. I'm going to replace these piston rings. It only makes sense if I've gone this far to take it apart. I'm going to be replacing the piston ring. Hopefully we're going to reuse the piston. It should spec out within wear tolerance. Hopefully we're going to be able to reuse the cylinder without boring it and just end up honing it. I'll get the piston measured when I take it to the machine shop to have the cylinder honed, and if it's okay, then I'll just get new rings for it. The rings, when they come out, I always make sure I put them down on the bench in the same orientation they came out, so that I can make note of whether or not there's a difference in the ring. These rings, when you look at the end section of the ring, at the very end of the ring, you can actually see the cross section of the ring is perfectly rectangular. So there is nothing to worry about on this. There is a very slight bevel, but that bevel is on both sides of the ring. What you end up with on some piston rings is you end up with a bevel on one side and not the other, and that ring has to be oriented a very specific way. You don't want to put that ring on upside down. These particular rings that came off here, which are probably the stock rings, they do not have that peculiarity. So these could go on, theoretically, if they were brand new, you could put these on in either direction. They'd be perfectly fine. I decided I'm going to mic the OD of the wrist pin. Basically what you want to do is you want to take a cross section of the wrist pin in a couple of different positions in case it's not in case it's worn in a way so it's out of round, and you want to record the min and the max diameters that you end up with. And then I don't have a micrometer big enough to do a piston, but just for the heck of it, I'll use my vernier calipers and take a measurement on the piston. Okay, I mic'd the wrist pin, and it's nice that it's perfectly round, and there's really no indication of wear difference between the end of the pin, the areas that I haven't been really in contact with anything, and the rest of it. I'm getting 867 thousandths right across, and rotated 90 degrees, and same thing. So that's a good omen. And also, when I insert the pin in the piston, there is no indication of any free play whatsoever, which is another good sign. And then I noticed that when I inserted the wrist pin into the top of the connecting rod, same situation, no visible feeling of end play to indicate that there was a wear issue between the top of the connecting rod and the wrist pin. So I'll compare that to the wear limits that should be somewhere in the service manual, but I have a feeling that, again, machine only had 1,000 miles on it, probably going to be perfectly fine. While I've got the micrometer handy, I'm going to look at the camshaft, and what I'm measuring for in the camshaft is I'm measuring the journals that the camshaft part of the camshaft that actually rides in the top of the cylinder head and supports the camshaft, which you've got one here, this large one here, and this one here on the end. And then the other thing I want to look at is I want to look at the large dimension of the lobes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for the largest dimension of the lobe, which is going to be like here. The idea being that you find the highest point, and that's going to be the measurement you record. Okay, I did the journals first, and I came up with 905 thousandths, just a hair over 904 thousandths, 9045 and 9045. So there's very little difference between the three, which is what I would expect on a motor of this low mileage. And now I'm switching to a larger micrometer so I can get a look at the lobes on the cam. Alright, I finished miking the lobes on the camshaft. The two inboard lobes both mic'd out at 437 thousandths. The two outboard lobes mic'd out at 443 thousandths. The two inboard lobes are the two intake valves, and the outboard ones are the exhaust valve. Now I'm going to clean up the cylinder, and I want to remove, there's an O-ring, actually sits in a groove in the bottom here. I want to remove that O-ring, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up this gasket mating surface. It's got some remnants of what looks like some black RTV on there, and then obviously I'm going to want to clean up the cylinder itself, get that rust and stuff that's on there off of there, and also the top here. I cleaned up the cylinder, and I was looking at it, and it's really a shame. This motor really didn't have a lot of hours on it. You can tell because what I can actually see, you can actually see that there's a line right here where my finger is, and anything below the line is where the piston rings were stuck, is right at this line. And so anything below the line is the cylinder wall that was more like the original cylinder wall, how it looked before the catastrophe. And then anything above it is pretty much damage that was caused just by the water sitting in there and the moisture after it was seized and just left to oxidize. The reason why I could tell that this really had low mileage on it, not only was the odometer only 1,000 miles, but if you look real closely, I don't know if I can use this, these little what look like scratches that actually alternate, that's actually the remnants of the crosshatch pattern from the original honing of the cylinder, and so those never even get a chance to wear off. So it's actually in great shape. Problem is, you can feel when I rub with my finger, this is smooth as glass until I get right to this point here where the oxidized area is. And I did try and clean that off, and that's not just wiping off, that's in the surface of the metal. So the cylinder is going to have to be honed. So hopefully that's all that it's going to need. I think the wear diameter is going to be probably just fine. It's also interesting, this is a pressed in sleeve. You can see this is a hardened steel sleeve that's pressed into the aluminum jug for durability. Here's a view from the bottom side. Again, you can really see that crosshatch pattern. And then there is some discoloration down here. There's probably some moisture sitting there also. So otherwise it looks pretty good. So the last thing I want to do to this cylinder assembly is I want to remove this remnants of this this black RTV sealant. And that's what the surface looks like after it's cleaned.